Thanks for joining Multifamily Talks, a RealPage podcast. On this episode of the show, I'm joined by Sharon Wilson Geno, president of the National Multifamily Housing Council. Sharon was at our offices speaking to all of RealPage at our monthly town hall and graciously accepted the offer to sit down with me here in the studio. Of course, our conversations focused on the role that NMHC plays in advocating for the multifamily housing industry in Washington, with a specific focus on how we can work collectively to provide more housing, and specifically affordable housing, to the American people. We also explored her experience after a year in the position and the accomplishments that the NMHC team has delivered, the challenges surrounding technology in the multifamily space, and how the ever-popular OpTech conference can become more of an evergreen event versus a single point-in-time conference. We then wrapped up the conversation by spending time discussing how all of us in the industry can contribute to the efforts of the NMHC and other collaborative organizations that are striving to magnify the impact that housing providers have in our nation. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did, and with that, let's get to the show. Sharon, thanks for joining us here at RealPage. Now, you've been here pretty much all morning, which we very much appreciate, having you come in and sharing, what NMHC is doing. But I want to start, for those who weren't having the benefit of sitting in the auditorium this morning, talk to us a little bit about how you got into the role that you're in now, leading NMHC here in 2023.
Sure. So I come at this work from really two perspectives academically, both as a lawyer and a practicing lawyer for a period of time, and then also I have a degree in urban planning and urban studies. Okay. So it was really a perfect marriage for me to get involved in housing and housing policy. I started my career in St. Louis, Missouri, where I'm from, working across the table and in partnership with residents who were being asked to move for different reasons, largely in the affordable housing space, often for urban redevelopment projects, but also in the wake of disaster. Wow. So I learned a lot about people and what goes on in people making housing choices, particularly under a sense of duress, and particularly groups of folks that don't have a lot of choices and need affordable opportunities. So I learned a lot from that experience. I moved to Washington, where I've been for now going on 30 years, and worked in two different law firms, working on transactions to help build that housing. Okay. and really help with some of the regulatory issues related to HUD and other affordable housing programs. And as part of that work, I did advocacy work on behalf of affordable housing interests, and particularly the public housing program. So a great way to learn that relationship between the work I was doing on the ground in St. Louis with the policies that were dictating how that work had to happen. And then over a period of time, I really enjoyed working with a number of my clients, really hip to hip, on issues and being embedded in their work on a day-to-day basis and advancing an organization. So I had the opportunity to work for a large nonprofit affordable housing provider, both as their lawyer and then eventually running their business platform, which we had about 14,000 units of affordable housing across the country. And then I also ran the senior care platform as well. So learned a lot about that intersection between the services that are provided by housing as well as the real estate aspect of it.
So it really had both the legislative and the law background, but as well as the boots on the ground operation of multifamily housing of multiple types.
Exactly. And there are so few opportunities that would allow me to take, and this was the thing that was most attractive to me, a little piece of everything that I've done in the past and bring them all together. And here at NMHC, I feel like I'm really able to do that. It's some of the advocacy work, the regulatory work, the legal work, but also that boots on the ground operator perspective as well. And I wasn't so sure I wanted to make a leap. I really enjoyed being an operator, believe it or not.
I believe it. Yeah.
But it's also this moment in time. We really have an opportunity here where housing has now been elevated as an issue to make systemic change and to create a more friendly environment to build the housing we need in this country today. So it was a really good opportunity to do that at this particular time.
Okay, so it sounds like you actually kind of the perfect blend of background to fit into this situation, this position of leadership, which, if memory serves me correct, you've been in almost a year to the day, not quite.
Just there. Over a year.
Oh, just over a year. Okay, I'm off then. So, with a year gone, if you wouldn't mind sharing, what's one of the ways that it's kind of differed from what your expectation was, kind of coming in?
I had a pretty good sense going in that this was a moment in time.
Yeah.
Probably the biggest difference is how fast that has come. It was really accelerated. Things happen relatively slowly in Washington typically. So while you could see the elevation of housing as a political issue, and then also the various opportunities to influence policy around that, really after the first of the year this year, the housing situation post-COVID has become really acute. Lawmakers have finally woken up and seen that issue, and there have now just been a raft of proposals that have come down the pike very, very quickly over the last 10 months. And the speed at which that's moved has been somewhat surprising. But I have a great team at NMHC, and we are managing all of it, and I'm very proud of them.
No, and you guys do a fantastic job with that, and we really appreciate your advocacy in the industry. I'll turn the question just slightly differently on that. You've been in a year, and granted, you mentioned Washington moves very slowly, and that's who you're trying to influence more than anything. But in that year, what's been either the accomplishment or the progress or whatever the case that you're the most proud of leading NMHC in that year time frame?
Yeah, there are so many, and some things are things that have actually happened, and there are things also that nobody gets credit for that don't happen, and I'm proud of both of those as well. One thing that I'll point to is just at the end of January, the White House announced something called the Resident-Centered Management Practices Challenge, where they've asked different players within the apartment industry to step forward and make voluntary commitments to do things that would help improve the renter housing provider relationship.
Right.
And NMHC agreed to do, with the help of our own leadership, a set of principles, business principles around what a professionally managed apartment should purvey in its relationship with its customers. I'm very proud of how quickly we were able to pull this together. We brought our leadership together. We brought focus groups of actual operators and managers together to give us input. We did surveys across the country of renters and homeowners in 4 different focus group areas, and brought all that information together and announced something the past couple months called the Foundations for Rental Housing.
Right.
And it's really 6 principles of what that relationship would look like and how to be a responsible, professionally managed property manager. And we've got now over 100 different organizations, including RealPage. Thank you very much for supporting that effort. Over 4 million units of apartment housing signed on to that. Awesome. In all 50 states. So we're continuing to sign people up. So if anybody's interested, please see our website, NMHC/Foundations of Rental Housing, and learn how you can participate as well.
Absolutely. And I always put the tech team on the spot. All these things we're going to put in the show notes. I don't even know if we actually can do that in the show notes, but I always put them on the spot to say we're going to do that. So we'll include that.
That'd be great.
But one of the things I've heard really as a consistent voice coming from you in NMHC, and Jay's not here today, but he has a voice in this too, is just the increased need for affordable housing. Yes. With the little A, not necessarily the big A, but both really. One of the things that I've heard you advocate for is this concept of voluntary rent control versus kind of mandated rent control. If you wouldn't mind, can you kind of expand a little bit and talk to the listener a little about what you mean by what that concept of voluntary rent control is? Sure.
Unfortunately, this idea of controlling rents has been captured around this idea that regulation is imposed and owners of rental housing have to bear 100% of the cost of whatever that regulatory structure is. We have been doing voluntary rent control in this country for decades, and it's worked, except in cases where we haven't put enough money into it. And those are our old Section 8 programs, our other opportunities to provide housing subsidy and different kinds of incentives for owners and operators of housing to serve a more affordable population. Tax abatements on the local level are a great tool. The Section 8 federal program, the low-income housing tax credit program. So we've been doing these programs and trying different things for quite some time. We just haven't put enough money into it to make the dent that we need. So I am hopeful that as people talk about rent control, let's shift the burden 100% to owners and operators, which will decrease the capital that we need to build more housing. Right. Let's incentivize people to create those opportunities instead.
So you mentioned the incentivization and the LIHTC program, which if I'm not on the Hill, so I'm not an expert in this, but if I understand and heard you earlier, there's a proposal that's currently out there for the extension, essentially implementation of a broader LIHTC program. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what NMHC's efforts are to kind of push that over the line with lawmakers in Washington today?
Yes, it is our number one legislative priority right now, but we don't do anything alone. We do it in coalitions with other groups and organizations, and there are. This is an area where I think almost every housing supporting organization, no matter what aspect they come from, is behind this bill. It has gotten incredible bipartisan support. I think over 70 members of the 100-member Senate have already signed on to the bill, which is incredible.
I'm not sure 70 members have agreed on anything in this environment.
Exactly. The struggle is in an atmosphere where there are very thin margins in both the House and the Senate, and a lot of disagreement about a lot of other things, and a lot of other things going on at the same time, trying to get priority for this bill. We know that it'll work very quickly, but we need to start today, because it takes 2 or 3 years to get LIHTC sponsored housing out the door. So we have a shortage today. Best case scenario, if we pass this bill tomorrow, we're still 2 or 3 years away from seeing its impact. So we need to pass it as soon as possible.
So what can a member of the multifamily family of industry like myself do to help kind of push that? Is it contact their congressman? Is it contact their representatives? Obviously we'll talk about donations later, but what can we do to help in your efforts?
Absolutely. Contact your congressman, contact your senators. They actually do listen to their constituents more so than they listen to anybody. Being involved in state and local organizations that advocate for affordable housing, being sure that if LIHTC funded property is slated to come into your community, that you're there at the community meeting saying, hey, we support that. We welcome this kind of housing in our communities. What we get some pushback on is oftentimes local communities are not welcoming of the opportunity for people at a more affordable price to come into those communities. The data really shows the exact opposite. It shows that the improvement and the building of low to moderate income housing in communities actually improves property values and makes communities more viable. So being involved at the local level will trickle up to the members of Congress who are all going to be running next year for another cycle. So if they hear that their constituents believe in this program, they too will believe in it as well.
Well, and you brought up something kind of in the undertones you just mentioned, and really two things that we'll, I hope, dig into a little bit. NIMBYism is certainly one of them, and I heard you earlier today a couple different times say YIMBYism, which I love that, and I want to get into that. But also the narrative around housing. Obviously, there's a narrative around housing, particularly rental housing. We saw it in our renter study where renters believe that there's a negative stigma around their situation. We hear it coming from leaders at all levels in government. How does NMHC and you guys essentially push back and re-educate against that?
Yeah, and I think while COVID has created a lot of challenges for the rental housing industry, I think it's also created opportunity. Okay. And this is a way for us to capitalize on that opportunity. For far too long, I think there has been a sense that the gold standard for housing has been homeownership and 4 freestanding walls and a patch of grass. And we have promoted that with the biggest federal subsidy program that we have, which is the mortgage interest deduction. And homeownership is incredibly important, and just one piece of a broader opportunity to create a variety of housing options so people can live their best lives at different times in their life. Sometimes when you're young, it makes more sense to be mobile. When you're a senior, having the responsibilities of home ownership may not be for you, and it may not be for you financially. The real game changer coming out of COVID, I think what you saw is mass migration of people to different parts of the country, away from urban cores where they were going to work in an office every day of the week. Right. And they were freed from some of that. Many of them moved to smaller communities or more rural communities and are working remotely. Some of them in an effort to support family members who may be sick, or to create a different kind of environment for children, or whatever that is. We need a bigger variety of housing, rental and home ownership in different communities across the country so people can truly live their best lives. And that's what I see as the opportunity.
Yeah, I think to a degree, and it's funny you mentioned the times of life, because literally I'm dealing with my mother's house that we're selling as she's moving into senior housing. Like the offer is going through today, literally.
Yeah, wow.
So if the phone rings, I'm sorry.
That's a big thing.
Yes. But it is that concept also of what people sell as the American dream. You know, the American dream is the 4 freestanding walls with a patch of grass. Again, going back to our renter study that we kind of, that isn't necessarily what the younger generation is really seeing. So it's kind of that shift with the tide. So I appreciate that commentary. You know, one of the things you brought up in the conversation earlier today with the broader RealPage group was the misconception of fairness in the relationship between landlord and tenant. Would you mind explaining just a little bit about what that was from a conversation perspective today, so we can kind of build off that for the listener who wasn't in the room with us this morning?
Sure. And again, I'll be the first to say that not all rental housing providers operate appropriately in the context of their relationships with their residents.
Right.
There are some bad cases, but there are bad policemen, there are bad teachers, there are bad firemen. Part of our reason for working on the foundations of rental housing, and I think part of our responsibility as an industry, is to set that bar and bring everybody up to that bar of having a real fair and appropriate business relationship with their customer base. All the incentive, what I think gets lost in this conversation is all the incentives run toward having a good conversation, or a good relationship, collaborative relationship between renters and rental housing providers. And there are a lot of state and local laws and other opportunities that define that relationship in the lease arrangement and other things, like any other business relationship.
Right.
I think it's important that we continue to amplify what those things are, and being sure that we're bringing everybody in this industry to a foundational standard of operating in a transparent and above board manner.
Yeah, and when I think about that fairness and you know, coming from an operational background and asset management background, you know, I've always thought of operating multifamily housing as providing people homes.
Exactly.
Like there's nothing more intimate that we can provide than actually being able to provide people's homes. So I very much appreciate fighting against that stigma. But you know, one of the areas that we see pretty intense scrutiny on in some areas is kind of the concept of resident screening, and people utilizing resident screening legislation to, in theory, provide a way to provide more housing opportunities. Is that a theory you agree with or contradict back on, and if so, why?
Well, I think, I mean, it's a delicate balance.
Sure.
And I think sometimes groups that are advocating for, quote, what they perceive as more opportunity is really in the end going to create less opportunity, because other renters in that market are going to be hurt by the inability to have a quality community where everybody plays by the rules.
Right.
And what that does, and we talked a little bit about NIMBYism, that reinforces this negative connotation that rental housing isn't good for communities, and then we don't have the housing that we need so people can make the choices they need to make. So some of those initiatives are really important. They should be no-brainers in some cases, right? In other cases, they truly shift the relationship and create a lot of barriers to ensuring that properties are managed appropriately for the good of everyone in that building, not just a particular renter.
Yeah, and you mentioned, you know, the impact on other renters, you know, and I go back to rent control when we think about that. You know, obviously from a screening perspective, if we're not able to kind of lift the overall quality from a financial perspective of the residents, that's one thing. But from a rent control perspective, obviously that tends to have people stay in units longer, taking more supply off of the market because they're just not turning, which ultimately from a price point perspective and affordability perspective, it comes down to supply and demand. And we're going to keep coming back to it. It's like, you know, how do we put more supply in the market? How do we put more supply in the market? How do we put more supply in the market? But as I kind of think through, especially like the screening we were just talking about, a lot of these issues really are local issues, not necessarily federal or for Capitol Hill. So, you know, how much harder does that make it on groups like NMHC to drive effective change?
It makes it, it's just another challenge. But at the same time, all things are connected, right? So while NMHC is a federal advocacy organization, we work in partnership with the National Apartment Association on all of our federal advocacy work, which we've been doing for over 30 years. It is such a great in taking this job, it was really a great opportunity for me to say, hey, you know, our apartment industry is speaking with one voice, and it makes us much more powerful than we would be otherwise. NAA has state and local chapters, so we are the beneficiaries of that information, and that informs a lot of our federal policy, as do our own members, in helping us to gain access to that information as well. But what's happening is, keep in mind that federal lawmakers in the House and the Senate are elected by guess who? People in states,
right,
and people in localities.
Yep.
So as housing is becoming an increasingly important issue on the local level, and there's pressure to create those solutions, and some of them are state and local, the federal government can play a role in incentivizing some of those as well. A couple of initiatives we've been working on, we were instrumental in passing a bill, a pro-housing bill that provide $85 million for HUD. It's a small amount of money in the greater scheme of life, to incentivize state and local governments who will implement reductions in their zoning requirements to allow for more multifamily, more housing production. That's a great start.
Right.
There is some effort at the Department of Transportation to put some money both into housing, incentivizing housing around transit nubs so people have access to transit, but also to tying federal transportation dollars to communities that will reduce the barriers to building new multifamily. And that's another way the federal government can play a role.
Well, and I don't want to gloss over the fact that you said $85 million is kind of a small peanuts in the broad world of federal spending, and I get that. But you also mentioned a stat earlier today that I actually didn't know and blew me away, and that was that 75% of all land in suburban areas is zoned single-family housing.
Yes.
You can't build multifamily on it. So efforts like that where hey, can we go get these things rezoned, and pressure on that can have a huge effect overall on it.
Exactly. And create, even in a number of communities are already playing around with this, and they are very difficult discussions, often between longtime residents of certain communities who don't want change and people who can't get in. And I think we're getting into this, rent control is another place where this happens. When you create artificial incentives outside of the regular turnover in the marketplace for people to remain in place, you are doing that to the exclusion of others.
Right.
And our population in this country is just growing, and we may not want to recognize that, but it is the truth. We had 300 million Americans in 2012. We will have 400 million Americans by 2058, 55. COVID has not slowed that down. Drops in birth rate have not slowed that down. A lot of it will be driven by immigration and longevity. So we have to find places for people to live, and they need to be able to access communities that they may not have been able to access in the past.
Yeah, and again, it keeps coming back to the supply situation. I mean, you're talking about a 25% growth for the nation in 40 years. But I want to go back to something you alluded to, actually you straight up said, was the coalition between NAA and NMHC. But the coalitions you guys are working with don't stop there. You're working with several others. Can you share some of the other ways that NMHC is working with other organizations to drive the ability to have affordable housing across the United States?
Sure, and there are a couple that are really important. One is our Housing Affordability Coalition, which is about 27 or 28 national organizations from all parts of the real estate housing ecosystem that is advocating for affordability solutions. In fact, they're one of the groups that is helping us work on solutions to the insurance crisis. Okay. Because the insurance crisis is now an affordability issue. Yeah. We have another coalition that's a smaller coalition that we respond together, about 12 different groups. It's from different parts of the rural community, urban, affordable, market rate, where we work on responding to various regulatory proposals and how they impact real estate. And we do them together. We edit letters together, and we speak with one voice there as well. And then finally, we have a new coalition called the Housing Solutions Coalition, which we're just launching. I'm very excited about. It's with us and 4 other large national real estate organizations to educate and communicate in communities across the country around the facts around rent control and how rent control actually hurts renters and does not help them, and then provides other solutions for state and local or communities to look at that will help increase housing supply.
Okay, so I love the fact that the organizations are working together towards common goals. A long time when you start in the charity work, which my wife and I were in for a little bit, like you learn real quick, if you're going to start a charity, look and see if other charities are doing that already and either combine forces or join them. So I love that. But, you'd mentioned bringing this down to a local level. Can you share an examples of any positive local or state policy housings that you've seen kind of come through in the last year that you've been around?
Sure. There are a number of really good ones. There's always housing legislation going on in California.
Yes.
Always,
Native California,
always,
I get it.
Exactly. Always. And while, California continues to struggle and they get a bad rap on a number of things, most notably they passed a bill called SB 35 a couple of years ago, which allowed for accelerated approval of housing developments that had an affordable component to them. The research on that, now that we have a year or two into it, shows, and even anecdotal information shows that has put affordable housing on the ground much faster than it would have otherwise. It has saved money because there is so much cost associated with delays at the zoning level. So that's one example of something that's working. In Florida, they did something really interesting. Instead of having all these different housing bills, which is what happens in California, they really packaged things together. And they took legislation that was being proposed around reducing zoning barriers and other barriers at the local level to help build more housing. They put their money where their mouth is. They put almost $800 million new dollars into affordable housing, and they closed the door on rent control. It was probably one of the most bipartisan initiatives that has ever happened in the state of Florida in recent years, signed very quickly by the governor. But by putting all three of those things together, everybody who had some view on various aspects of that had to give something up to get something more important. And we think packaging those kinds of initiatives together in states across the country will help us move that ball forward faster.
Yeah, it's interesting, the two success stories you have are from two very different states, but it shows that both can have those success stories if they really put their minds to it and actually do something. So it's encouraging. Okay, so we've talked a lot about affordable housing and the need for more supply, but that's not the only focus of NMHC. What are the other 2 to 3 driving focuses that you really have your team dialed in on now?
Yeah, we're very focused on creating that liquidity in the capital markets to build housing at all price points. Yeah. We just need more.
Right.
And with increasingly challenging interest rate environment, now we have the insurance crisis, and I will call it a crisis, and a number of other factors that are going on in those capital markets. We're struggling to find the resources at any price point, frankly, to move the ball forward on deals that have been in the pipeline in some cases for some period of time. So we're very focused on those issues. We continue to focus on the regulatory environment and just breaking down barriers because time is money, right? and jumping through more hoops makes it more difficult. And then, as I mentioned briefly, the insurance crisis that is not only preventing new supply from coming on board, but it's increasing the cost of operations. And as we increase the cost of operations, our ability to make our rates of return in housing at any price point on the capital that's invested in that, it's going to, if we don't help solve that problem, it's going to make it increasingly difficult for us as well. So those are 3 areas that we're spending a lot of our time on right now.
Yeah, and the simple reality is if you're not going to be able to at least recap your investment from the capital being put in to build, and the reality is real estate is a very capital intensive business. It takes a lot to build a building and then run it over time. It's just not going to see that. People will start putting their investments in other areas they can get that demand.
Exactly right.
So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because there's one area that I was hoping you were going to say, but you didn't say, of where NMHC is focused. We're sitting here in Real Page's headquarters. I would be remiss if I didn't ask about a technology side of the equation. Is there area around technology that NMHC is also thinking about? Whether it be access to connectivity or anything along those kind of lines.
Our investment in technology advocacy has gone through the roof last year.
We appreciate that. Thank you.
No, it is. It's another area that's just exploded much faster than one would have expected, perhaps. With the, I think, frankly, the introduction of ChatGPT in recent months has really accelerated the common man's view of
an awareness
of quote AI, and then. AI has been with us for quite some time, but it really has elevated that issue. And now there's a lot of policymakers talking about we need to regulate, we need to legislate investment in it. So that's been a particularly important area of ours. There's a lot of focus in the rental housing space around the use of AI in resident selection,
right,
and what does that mean for our work. Continued focus on getting broadband connectivity in the wake of COVID. We've seen the importance of that. The federal government appropriated a significant amount of money, all of which has taken time to trickle through the states and get implemented. That money is starting to go out the door. We want to be sure multifamily is at the table and a priority for getting those investments, so everybody living in multifamily can have good access to connectivity. And then finally, data privacy and cybersecurity remains a huge issue for everyone. And so we continue to advocate for ways that multifamily can be protected and ensure that there are standards, mostly industry-driven standards, but standards of operation rather than regulation,
right,
to ensure that people are operating in an appropriate way, but that they're flexible enough to be adaptable to different types of multifamily housing.
Okay, good. So because that was one of the things I was thinking of with just the focus of NMHC. Like my first exposure to NMHC, and granted this is a decade plus ago at this point, my first exposure to NMHC really was through OpTech. So it was, hey, what's coming new in the industry? It really is and continues to be. In fact, we're coming up on it here real quick.
Yes.
By the timing of this recording, the industry's leading aspect of what's new up and coming from a technology perspective. As you're thinking about the future of everything you just mentioned, as well as how the industry receives it, do you see that OpTech is still going to be that main vehicle, or are you thinking of other ways that you can kind of educate the multifamily industry on what is out there, and kind of what are your thoughts around that? Because you guys have been a leader in this space for a while.
Yeah, we've really, our plan is really to expand and grow and make permanent the work that has come out of OpTech now for almost 20 years. Yeah. We were on the front end of that. And the thing that I think is so great about OpTech is it's not just a marketplace of products, it is a marketplace of ideas.
Very much so.
And it's a place where people, operators and suppliers and startups and people from all aspects of operations come together to share perspective, which is just going to make us all better. And it does have an opportunity for product, but in many ways, it's those ideas that help inform the advocacy work that we're doing to ensure that we have the right ecosystem that will allow us to continue to innovate, will ensure that we're sharing. And this has always been a collaborative space, multifamily housing generally speaking, but particularly around the property technology community. That's been a pretty collaborative space as well. To be sure that we're setting standards that are appropriate for our investors, and I mean both on the PropTech side as well as our owner-operators, but also that help protect the residents that we serve. So, but much of that has to happen when people come together and set those standards from an industry perspective, and we continue to be agile in setting those standards rather than having a federal regulatory scheme that's going to come up and tell us what to do. It's really important for us as NMHC, and within the NMHC umbrella, we're really going to elevate that so we are at the forefront of that and not just reacting to that.
No, and I love that because, again, it's about having more good actors than bad actors, as we kind of talked about in the beginning, and again, holding ourselves to a high enough standard that you don't need regulation coming in on top of it. Also, just again, OpTech has always been my favorite conference to go to, even when I was on the operations side of the business, because it is not just about the products. It is so much about how are we thinking about the business, and not just from a technological perspective. So for those listening, there's still time to register if you want to get there. Yes. If you haven't gotten there this year, at least, I don't know when this is going to air. There might not be time for actually them to register, but there's always the following year. So before we get to one last question, I gave you a little bit of a warning that I was going to give you this question. One of the things that I have been asking all the guests that come in on this part of the voice of Multifamily Talks is, if you could go back and give one book recommendation to someone who wants to become a leader within the multifamily space, and I'll let you choose which part of the space it is. If it's on the vendor technology side, if it's on the institutional investment side, if it's on the regulation side, I'll let you choose. What would that one book be, and what is it about that book that you think is so important?
Yeah, can I give you two?
Yeah, it's so funny. Almost everyone does. So yes.
Awesome. Okay. One is a teeny tiny book, and it's been around for about 20-something years, but I use it a lot with staff, even frontline staff. called Our Iceberg is Melting. And it's this fable of how change and how people react to change, and how those that are most agile and most thoughtful are the ones that are going to be most successful, and the most important lesson from that book is how you bring people along through change, even those that are not as open to it or as willing to accept it.
Okay.
And I think that's a really important thing for leaders to understand, that it's
Absolutely.
not just, I'm about change, we're going to do this. It's about, how do I bring other people along with me to create that opportunity to make the changes we need to make that will make us successful in the future. So that's that one I always love. And then the other one is a book by Cy Wakeman called No Ego. And what No Ego really gets to is this idea that the work that we do has to be collaborative and across different silos of the pieces that we do.
Okay.
And again, we sometimes are like, we have this department, we have this department, we have this department.
Sure.
Increasingly, given what's going on in real estate and multifamily generally, all of these things have to weave together. The operations teams have to be working really tightly with the development teams, have to be working really tightly with the asset management teams, have to be working very tightly with the capital markets teams. Yeah. So, and in doing so, you can't have one winner and one loser. Everybody has to understand that we're coming to work for an ultimate goal, and we have to work in a team environment in order to do that. So that's another one I like.
I love it. So leading through change by actually understanding that people experience change differently, and to go through that, and then making sure that, again, we're all working towards a common goal, but not with the silos that we love to break down here at RealPage. You'll hear a lot of us talk about breaking those down. So thank you for that. I very much appreciate that. So I'm going to finish with kind of one last question. It's kind of a two-part question. If there's anything that you want to make sure that our listeners hear about what NMHC is doing, let's go ahead and put that there. But also, more importantly, how can they get involved? Like, how can people at all levels get involved with the efforts that NMHC is putting forward?
Well, as I said, we are at this moment in time, this critical moment in time where industries have been sort of in the spotlight of federal policy at different times, and then something happens, and then whatever the reaction is becomes their trajectory for the next decades or so. We saw that happen in the airline industry. We've seen that happen in the auto industry. This is our moment. And so I think everybody putting their voice either through contacting their congressional representatives, working in their own backyards to understand what's going on the state and local level around housing, and being a voice in your own community for accepting of multifamily housing and being an advocate for that is really important. And we're coming into an election year. Vote.
Yes,
vote.
Key.
And don't just vote for the federal election candidates and take the top tier. Vote for the school board member. Vote in the primary for the school board or the county council member, because those are your leaders of tomorrow.
Yeah.
And it's so critical to know who they are, what they stand for, and be sure they know that you're here for multifamily housing, and that's an important issue to you and you're a constituent. There is no substitute for that. Yeah,
and including, as you mentioned that, in the off-cycle years. I was involved with a campaign, a local campaign in the town I was in, and it was amazing to see, because I wasn't really aware of this, but it was amazing to see the difference in the vote count during a presidential cycle campaign versus an off-cycle campaign. I mean, we're talking like 3-1.
Right.
So getting in that local level. But Sharon, thank you so much for coming in and sitting down with me. Thanks for the entire time you spent here at RealPage. And most of all, thank you and NMHC just for the wonderful partnership and advocacy you have for the industry. Well, thank you, Andrew. And just thank you to RealPage for all your incredible support. You share with us your time, talent, and treasure, all three. And all three are very valuable to us. So thank you. Thanks. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Multifamily Talks, a RealPage podcast. As always, the views expressed are those of the individuals participating and not those of RealPage.